I remember the precise moment my faith in the Emperor began to die. Not instantly, mind you. Faith rarely vanishes in a single moment. Rather, it erodes like a cliff face battered by a relentless sea until one day the foundation simply gives way. My name is Jorven Krael, once Commissar of the 117th Cadian Regiment. I say once, for that title holds no meaning here. Titles, ranks, honors, these are all constructs of civilization, and I am no longer in a civilized realm. The stench hits you first. Always the stench. Blood and excrement and sweat, all mingling into a miasma so thick it feels like drowning. The air itself becomes a weapon against your senses, an invisible toxin that never abates. The brain eventually adjusts, of course. The human mind has remarkable adaptability, even to the most grotesque conditions. This is both our greatest strength and most terrible weakness. I awoke in darkness, not complete darkness, mind you, but the sickly green glow of fungal light that passes for illumination in orcish domains. My head throbbed with pain, blood caking my scalp where the blow had landed. The operation had gone wrong, catastrophically so. What was supposed to be a simple raid against an isolated orc outpost had turned into an ambush. How they knew we were coming, I still do not know. Intelligence failure, perhaps. Or treachery. In war, either is equally likely. The floor beneath me was metal, grating, rusted and slick with substances I chose not to contemplate. Above, a roof of corrugated metal sheets haphazardly welded together, creating a cacophony of dripping sounds as condensation gathered and fell. Around me, the moans and whimpers of other prisoners, though I could not see them in the gloom. The chamber was vast, I could sense that much, with row upon row of cages stretching into shadows. "Commissar?" A voice, barely a whisper, from somewhere to my right. "Commissar Krael, is that you?" I turned toward the sound, wincing as pain shot through my neck. A face emerged from the darkness, haggard and bruised but recognizable. Trooper Varun, one of my regiment's scouts. His left eye was swollen shut, dried blood tracking down his cheek like rust-colored tears. "Report, Trooper," I said automatically, my voice hoarse from thirst. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "Report? With respect, sir, there is nothing to report. The mission is lost. The platoon is dead. We are prisoners of the Greenskins." "How many survived?" I asked, ignoring his insubordination. In our current circumstances, protocol seemed a distant concern. From what I could tell, maybe 20 of us. The rest were killed in the ambush or executed after capture. The orcs seemed to find it amusing to make examples of the officers. You were spared because you were unconscious. They prefer their entertainment conscious. Entertainment, the word hung in the air like a curse. Even then, I did not truly understand what it meant to be entertainment for the orcs. That knowledge would come later, and with it, the first cracks in my faith. The sound of heavy footsteps interrupted our conversation, metal clanging against metal as something massive approached. Instinctively, we both retreated to the far corners of our respective cages. The footsteps stopped, and a guttural laugh echoed through the chamber. "New meat awake," a voice growled, thick with the crude accent of the Greenskins. A face appeared before my cage, green skin gleaming in the dim light, small red eyes glinting with cruel amusement. Not the biggest orc I had seen, but still massive compared to a human, muscles bulging beneath scarred skin. Yumi whiffed a fancy hat. "You special," the boss says. "You last longer than others, maybe." I remained silent, maintaining what dignity I could muster. The Commissar's Handbook contains no chapter on proper conduct when captured by Xenos. The standard doctrine is simple, if impractical, fight to the death. Capture is not an option officially acknowledged. Yet here I was, very much captured, very much alive. The orc grinned, revealing a row of jagged metal teeth. "Silent type, eh? Dat change soon. All Umis talk in da end. Or scream. Screaming good too." He laughed again, a sound like rocks in a metal drum. "Food soon. You fight good, you eat good. You fight bad, you still eat, but maybe lose some bits first." With that cryptic statement, he moved on, checking other cages, occasionally prodding the occupants with a crude metal rod that sparked with electrical discharge when it made contact. The screams that followed each touch were a dreadful chorus. What did he mean? Fight for food? I asked Varun when the orc had moved beyond earshot. "You will see soon enough, Commissar," he replied, his voice hollow with resignation. "They do not simply feed us. That would be too civilized, too practical. Everything with the orcs is spectacle, competition. They make games of our suffering." Before he could elaborate further, a deafening klaxon sounded, the noise reverberating painfully off the metal walls. The reaction from the prisoners was immediate and disturbing. Some curled into fetal positions, covering their ears and rocking back and forth. Others stood at attention, eyes wide with anticipation or terror. Varun simply closed his eyes and began muttering what sounded like a prayer. The far end of the chamber was suddenly illuminated as massive doors ground open, revealing a circular pit below. The floor around the pit was crowded with orcs of various sizes, all shouting and gesticulating wildly. Betting, I would later learn, betting on us, on our lives, our pain, our degradation. One by one, cages were detached from their moorings and lowered toward the pit. Inside each, a prisoner, some struggling frantically, others oddly calm, accepting their fate with a resignation that I would come to understand all too well. As each cage reached the bottom, it opened, depositing its occupant into the arena. In the center of the pit sat a mound of what appeared to be meat, rancid and crawling with maggots, but meat nonetheless. The game became immediately clear. Fight for food. Fight other prisoners. Fight for survival. I watched in horror as men who had once been comrades turned on each other with feral intensity. These were Imperial guardsmen, trained to stand shoulder to shoulder against the enemies of mankind. Yet here they were, reduced to animals, tearing at each other for scraps. And the orcs, how they roared their approval, throwing objects into the pit, sometimes aiming at specific prisoners, sometimes simply adding obstacles to the grim contest. "The first time is the hardest," Varun said quietly beside me. "You still remember who you were, what you stood for. The second time is easier. By the third, you stop thinking entirely. You become what they want you to become." "How long have you been here?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes from the spectacle below. 10 feedings, maybe 11. Time loses meaning. Some have been here longer. The ones who learn to entertain the greenskins, the ones who embrace what they have become. A particular struggle in the pit drew louder cheers from the orc audience. A large guardsman had another in a chokehold, slowly crushing his windpipe while simultaneously reaching for a piece of meat. The victim's eyes bulged, his face turning purple as he clawed desperately at his attacker's arms. "That is Sergeant Halleck," Varun said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He was known for his dedication to his men, once, would give his ration to the wounded. Now look at him." The sergeant's victim went limp, and the orcs roared their approval. Halleck released his hold and scrambled for the food, shoving it into his mouth without bothering to remove the maggots that writhed within. "Tomorrow it could be us down there," Varun continued. "If not tomorrow, then soon. They rotate the cages. Everyone gets their turn in the pit." I wanted to say something reassuring, something about maintaining faith in the Emperor, about the strength of the human spirit. The words that had always come so easily during battlefield addresses now stuck in my throat. What meaning did such platitudes have in this place? What relevance did the God Emperor have in this metal hell where humanity itself was stripped away bite by bite? As if reading my thoughts, Varun spoke again. "The Emperor cannot see us here, Commissar. This place exists outside his light. I should have reprimanded him for such heresy, should have reminded him of his duty, his faith. Instead, I remained silent, watching as below us Imperial guardsmen tore each other apart for rotting scraps while aliens laughed. That night, lying on the cold metal grating of my cage, listening to the moans of the wounded and the occasional bellowing laugh of an orc guard, I found myself unable to pray. The words of the Imperial Creed, memorized since childhood, seemed to evaporate from my mind. In their place, a single question repeated endlessly: what would I do when my cage was lowered into that pit? What would remain of Commissar Jorven Krael when faced with starvation and the primal need to survive? I did not sleep. Sleep was a luxury that belonged to another life. Instead, I existed in a state of wary consciousness, alert to every sound, every movement. Survival instinct, taking hold already. The human animal, emerging from beneath the veneer of civilization. The green fungal light never fully dimmed, casting the chamber in perpetual twilight. In this half-light, I took inventory of my prison. The cage was roughly 3 meters by 2, with a height that forced me to stoop slightly when standing. The bars were a hodgepodge of metal, some clearly scavenged from Imperial vehicles, others of unknown origin, all welded together with the crude effectiveness characteristic of orcish construction. Not pretty, but functional, solid. My captors had stripped me of my uniform jacket, bolt pistol, and power sword. Of course, the symbolic items of my office, my commissar's cap and red sash, were also gone, likely claimed as trophies. I still wore my black uniform trousers and boots, though the latter had been relieved of their hidden blade compartments. My identification tags still hung around my neck, the Imperial Aquila pressed against my chest like a small, cold reminder of a world that seemed increasingly distant. Across from me, Varun had managed to find sleep, his breathing steady, occasionally interrupted by small, whimpering sounds. To my left, an empty cage, its previous occupant perhaps one of those I had witnessed in the feeding pit. To my right, a figure sat motionless, facing away from me. As if sensing my attention, the figure turned. It was an elderly man, his face a web of wrinkles and scars, white beard matted with dirt and blood. His eyes, however, were startlingly clear, intense blue orbs that seemed to glow in the dim light. "The Commissar awakens," he said, his voice surprisingly strong for his apparent age. "I wondered when you would join our little community." "You know who I am?" I asked, a wheezing sound that might have been a laugh. "Everyone knows the Commissar, the man who shoots cowards, the embodiment of Imperial justice. Tell me, Commissar, where is your justice now?" I did not answer. There was no answer to give. "My name is Thorn," he continued after a moment. "Once a Medicae in the 44th Valhallan. Before your time, I expect. I have been in this charming establishment for what I estimate to be 3 standard months." 3 months. The thought was staggering. "How have you survived?" I asked. "By being useful," he replied simply. "The orcs have a crude understanding of medical care, mostly involving amputations and cauterization, but occasionally they require something more delicate. Keeping a prisoner alive for extended torture, for instance. That is where I come in." "You help them torture your fellow humans?" I could not keep the disgust from my voice. Another wheeze of laughter. "Judge me not, Commissar. In here we are all compromised. You will be too, soon enough. But no, I do not assist in torture. I merely patch up the victims afterwards, when the orcs tire of their screams. I extend their suffering, yes, but also their lives. Sometimes long enough for what you might call a merciful end." The implication was clear. Euthanasia. Mercy killing. Another crime to add to the list of heresies I was witnessing. Another violation of Imperial law that, in this context, seemed almost like compassion. "There will be another feeding tomorrow," Thorn said, changing the subject. "Your cage is in the rotation. Be prepared." "What advice would you give?" I asked, swallowing my pride. In this place, survival superseded rank. Thorn regarded me thoughtfully. "You are strong for an officer, and you have the advantage of your training. But strength alone will not save you. The orcs do not care only about who wins their little games, they care about who entertains. Sometimes, a good loss is more valuable than a victory. You suggest I lose deliberately? I suggest you understand the true nature of your predicament. You are not a prisoner of war, Commissar. You are a performer in a theater of cruelty. Learn the role that keeps you alive the longest." With that cryptic advice, he turned away again, conversation apparently over. I was left alone with my thoughts, turning his words over in my mind. A performer in a theater of cruelty. The concept was anathema to everything my training had instilled in me. Commissars did not perform. We commanded, we enforced, we embodied the unbending will of the Emperor, but the Emperor was not here. In his place were the greenskins, with their crude jokes and crueler entertainments. And I was beginning to understand that survival in this place might require a flexibility that my rigid training had never prepared me for. Morning, if such a term had meaning in this timeless hell, announced itself with the return of the Orc Guards. They moved through the chamber, prodding prisoners awake with their shock rods, occasionally stopping to torment those who reacted in particularly amusing ways. I sat rigidly in my cage, determined to show no weakness, no fear. The guard who stopped before my cage was different from the one the previous day. Larger, with a crude mechanical augmentation replacing his left eye, he peered at me with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. "Commissar man," he growled. "You fight today. Boss says make it good show, or you end up as squig food." He leaned closer, metal eye whirring as it focused. "I bet many teeth on you. You win, maybe I bring extra food later. You lose, I cut off fingers one by one." With that encouraging speech delivered, he moved on, leaving me to contemplate the additional pressure of orcish gambling on my survival. Beside me, Thorn stirred. "An honor," he said dryly. "Grimtooth himself has taken an interest in you. He is one of the boss's lieutenants. His favor can be valuable, if dangerous." I was about to inquire further when the now familiar klaxon sounded, signaling the beginning of the feeding ritual. Around us, prisoners reacted with the same mixture of terror and resignation I had observed the day before. Verun was awake now, his face set in grim determination. "Your turn today, Commissar," he said. "Remember, they want a show. Give them what they want, and you might survive." "And sacrifice my dignity in the process," I replied bitterly. A sad smile crossed his face. "Dignity? Look around you, sir. There is no dignity here. Only survival." Before I could respond, my cage gave a violent lurch. The sensation of falling was brief but intense, my stomach seeming to rise into my throat as the cage descended toward the pit. Around me, other cages were similarly in motion, containing the day's chosen performers. The noise hit me first as my cage approached the level of the orc spectators, a wall of sound, cheering, jeering, the clashing of crude weapons against metal surfaces. The smell came next, the stench of orcish bodies, a pungent mixture of sweat, fungus, and machine oil that somehow cut through even the omnipresent reek of the prison. My cage touched down on the floor of the pit with a jarring impact. Across from me, 3 other cages landed in similar fashion. I recognized one of the occupants, Corporal Deshin, a heavy weapons specialist from 3rd Platoon. The others were strangers to me, though their Imperial Guard uniforms, tattered and filthy as they were, marked them as comrades. A particularly large orc, his massive body covered in elaborate scars and crude tattoos, stepped forward to the edge of the pit. He wore what appeared to be a necklace made of human fingers, and his tusked mouth was set in a permanent leer. "Today special," he bellowed, his voice carrying easily over the crowd noise. "We got Commissar man Big Boss Umie who shoots his own boys. Now we see if he good at fighting or just good at killing scared Umis." The crowd roared its approval, and I felt a surge of hate so pure it momentarily overwhelmed my fear. I silently vowed that if I somehow survived this ordeal, this particular orc would die by my hand. With a grinding sound, the doors of our cages swung open. For a moment, none of us moved, each taking the measure of the others, of the arena, of our odds. In the center, as before, sat a pile of meat, this time accompanied by a few containers that might have held water. The orc leader laughed at our hesitation. What waiting for? Fight or no food? Maybe no fingers either. He made a cutting motion across his hand that needed no translation. Corporal Deshin was the first to move, sprinting toward the food pile with surprising speed for a man who had been imprisoned and malnourished. One of the strangers followed suit, while the third backed against the wall of the pit, clearly hoping to avoid conflict entirely. I stepped cautiously from my cage, assessing the situation. The pit was approximately 15 meters in diameter, its floor packed earth mixed with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The walls rose about 5 meters to where the orcs gathered, high enough to prevent escape, low enough to give the spectators a good view. Scattered around the arena were various objects, clearly placed there deliberately: a length of chain, a splintered piece of wood, a jagged metal shard. Weapons, of a sort, or at least implements that could be used as such. Another aspect of the entertainment. Deshin had reached the food pile and was struggling with the other prisoner, who had made a dash for it. They grappled awkwardly, each trying to secure some portion of the meager feast while denying the other. The orcs above howled with laughter at the spectacle. The third prisoner, seeing the others distracted, had begun edging toward one of the improvised weapons, the metal shard. A strategic thinker, that one. I found myself automatically analyzing his movements, his posture, identifying him as the most dangerous of my opponents, and they were opponents now, not comrades. The reality of the situation settled on me with crushing finality. To eat, I would have to fight. To survive, I might have to kill men who, in another context, I would have led into battle, would have died to protect. I became aware that the crowd noise had shifted, focusing on me. My inaction was drawing attention, and not the kind that would keep me alive. The orc leader was pointing at me, saying something that was drowned out by the general cacophony, but the meaning was clear enough. Do something, or something would be done to me. I moved toward the grappling pair at the food pile, not yet committed to a course of action but knowing I needed to participate in some fashion. As I approached, Deshin gained the upper hand, delivering a vicious elbow to his opponent's temple that sent the man sprawling. The corporal turned to face me, a piece of meat clutched in his fist, his expression a mixture of triumph and wariness. "Stay back, Commissar," he warned, voice ragged. "I respect your rank, but I will fight for this." "I have no wish to fight you, Corporal," I replied, keeping my distance, hands visible and non-threatening. "Perhaps we can share the resources, maintain some semblance of unit cohesion." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Unit cohesion? Look around you, sir. There is no unit here. There is only hunger. And entertainment," I said, gesturing subtly toward the watching orcs. "They expect us to tear each other apart. Every moment we cooperate denies them the spectacle they crave." Uncertainty flickered across his face. The military mind responding to a logical argument from a superior officer. For a moment, I thought I might have reached him, might have found a small victory against our captors. Then the metal shard took him in the back. The third prisoner, the strategic thinker I had noted earlier, had circled behind while we conversed. Now he twisted the makeshift blade, opening the wound further before yanking it free. Blood sprayed across the dirt as Deshin fell to his knees, the piece of meat tumbling from his nerveless fingers. The orcs erupted in appreciative roars. This was the violence they had been waiting for, the true entertainment beginning. I reacted instinctively, years of combat training taking over. As the attacker lunged toward me, I sidestepped, catching his wrist and using his own momentum to propel him past. He stumbled, off balance, and I delivered a precise strike to the back of his knee, dropping him to the ground. The metal shard fell from his grasp, and I kicked it away before he could recover it. He scrabbled in the dirt, trying to regain his feet, but I was on him quickly, a knee in his back, pinning him down. "Yield," I commanded, the authority in my voice automatic, a product of years of conditioning. He laughed, a desperate, broken sound. "Yield? This is not a dueling ground, Commissar. This is a death pit. There is no yielding here." The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. This was not combat as I understood it, with its rules and protocols. This was survival in its most primal form. And in that moment, a strange clarity descended upon me. If I was to survive, truly survive, and not just extend my suffering, I needed to understand the nature of this new battlefield. I released my hold and stood, backing away from the fallen man. He looked at me in confusion, clearly expecting a finishing blow. The orcs above had gone oddly quiet, perhaps equally confused by my actions. "I will not kill for their amusement," I declared, loudly enough for the closest orcs to hear. I turned in a slow circle, making eye contact with as many of the Xenos as possible. "I am Commissar Jorven Kryl of the Imperial Guard. I am not your plaything." The silence stretched for a long moment and then broke with a wave of jeering laughter. Objects began to rain down into the pit, bits of garbage, small rocks, even what appeared to be severed human fingers. The message was clear enough: fight or become the target. The man I had spared was on his feet now, eyeing me warily. Deshin lay motionless where he had fallen, whether dead or merely unconscious, I could not tell. The fourth prisoner, who had lost the initial grapple for food, had retreated to a corner of the pit, nursing what appeared to be a broken arm. I stood my ground as the bombardment continued, refusing to provide the violence the orcs craved. It was a small defiance, likely futile, but in that moment it felt vitally important. Some fragment of my identity as a commissar, as a human being, demanded this stand. The large orc leader bellowed something, and the rain of objects ceased. He pointed at me, then made a throat-cutting gesture. Two smaller orcs immediately detached from the crowd, vaulting down into the pit with surprising agility. Each carried a crude but effective-looking blade, and their intentions were unmistakable. They approached cautiously, spreading out to come at me from different angles. I turned slowly, keeping them both in view, aware that my chances against two armed orcs were virtually non-existent. Still, I would not die cowering. I took up a defensive stance, hands raised, feet planted firmly. "Come then," I said quietly. "Let us finish this." The orcs charged simultaneously, faster than their bulk would suggest possible. I dodged the first, using his momentum against him as I had with the human attacker, but the second caught me with a glancing blow across the ribs. Pain flared, hot and immediate, but the wound was not deep. I spun away, creating distance, reassessing. The crowd was fully engaged now, shouting what I assumed were encouragements to their fellows in the pit. The orc I had dodged rounded on me again, blades slashing in wild arcs. I retreated before the onslaught, looking desperately for some advantage, some weapon or strategy. My back hit the wall of the pit. No further retreat possible. The orcs closed in, confident now, enjoying the hunt. I tensed, prepared to launch myself in one final, hopeless attack. And then the most unexpected thing happened. The metal shard that had killed Deshin embedded itself in the eye of the nearest orc. The creature bellowed in pain, dropping its blade and clutching at the wound. The second orc turned in confusion, only to receive a length of chain whipped across its face. My rescuer was the fourth prisoner, the one with the apparently broken arm. The arm, it seemed, was very much functional, a ruse perhaps, or simply not as damaged as it had appeared. He wielded the chain with practiced skill, keeping the remaining orc at bay while backing toward me. "Commissar," he said without taking his eyes off his opponent, "I believe a strategic withdrawal is in order." I scooped up the blade dropped by the wounded orc. "Agreed, though our options appear limited." "There is always an option," he replied cryptically. Then, raising his voice to be heard by the spectators, "Is this the best you can offer? 2 runts against Imperial soldiers. Where is the sport in that?" The tactic was immediately clear. Appeal to the orcish love of challenge, of proving strength against worthy opponents. It was a gamble, but one born of desperate circumstances, and remarkably, it seemed to work. The crowd's mood shifted, some now jeering at the orcs in the pit rather than at us. The large leader silenced the crowd with a bellow. He studied us thoughtfully, or as thoughtfully as an orc's brutish features could manage. Then he grinned, revealing metal fangs interspersed with rotting natural teeth. "Umi's got fight," he declared. "Maybe too good for feeding pit, maybe good enough for real fight." This last statement drew a roar of approval from the assembled greenskins. At some signal I did not catch, more orcs descended into the pit. These did not attack, however, but rather secured the wounded one and began ushering us back toward our cages. My unlikely ally and I exchanged glances but offered no resistance. Whatever came next, it had to be preferable to being gutted in the dirt for the crime of refusing to kill a fellow guardsman. As my cage was hoisted back to its position among the others, I caught a glimpse of the orc leader watching me with what almost seemed like interest. Not the casual interest of a being observing a curiosity, but the calculated interest of a predator assessing potential. I had survived the feeding pit, but I had a sinking feeling that what awaited me now might make me wish I had not. When I returned to my place in the suspended cages, Thorn was watching me with an expression I could not quite read. Verun seemed relieved, though he tried to hide it behind military stoicism. "You survived," Thorn stated simply, "and made quite an impression, from what I could see." "I refused to kill for their entertainment," I replied, the adrenaline of combat now fading, leaving me shaky and acutely aware of the cut in my side. Not deep, but painful, and in these unsanitary conditions, potentially dangerous. "Yes," Thorn nodded. "A noble stand, and one that may have inadvertently saved your life, at least for now. The orcs respect strength, even when it takes the form of defiance." "What did the leader mean by a real fight?" I asked, pressing a hand against my wound to slow the bleeding. Thorn's expression darkened. "The arena. It is where they send prisoners they deem worthy of greater tests. Some survive for a time, becoming favorites of the crowd. Most do not last beyond their first match." "Match against what?" "Other prisoners. Captured Xenos. Squigs. Whatever the orcs find amusing on a given day." He paused, studying me. "You are injured. Show me." I hesitated, then lifted my shirt to reveal the wound. Thorn examined it from his cage, eyes narrowed in professional assessment. "Not life-threatening, if infection is prevented," he concluded. "And there lies the problem. In this place, even a scratch can fester and kill." As if summoned by our conversation, an orc appeared, different from the guards I had seen previously. Smaller, hunched, with what appeared to be crude medical implements hanging from a belt around his waist. A pain boy, I realized, the orcish equivalent of a medicae. He stopped before my cage, head tilted in curiosity. "Big boss says fix up, commissar man. Need good shape for big fight." Thorn spoke up from his cage. "The wound requires cleaning and stitching. I can guide you through the procedure." The pain boy glanced at him, snorting dismissively. "Old Umi think pain boy need help? Grotto know how fix. Cut off bits that bad, sew up rest. Simple." "The wound is minor," Thorn persisted. "No amputation required, merely antiseptic and sutures." "No fun that way," Grotto grumbled, but he seemed to accept the advice. My cage door was unlocked, and I was roughly hauled out. 2 guards appeared to escort me, shock rods at the ready should I attempt resistance. I had no such intention. The prospect of medical attention, however crude, was more appealing than slow death by infection. I was led through a series of corridors, each seemingly more ramshackle than the last. The architectural style, if it could be called that, pure orcish in its chaotic functionality. Everything looked as if it had been assembled from battlefield scrap, which it likely had been. Yet despite the apparent disorder, there was a brutal efficiency to the construction. Say what you will about the greenskins, they build to last. We arrived at what I can only describe as a torture chamber masquerading as a medical facility. Various implements hung from walls and ceilings, their purposes all too horribly clear. Tables with restraints occupied the center of the room, most bearing stains I preferred not to examine too closely. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of blood, cauterized flesh, and strange fungal compounds that I assumed served as orcish medicine. Grotto gestured toward one of the cleaner tables. Sit. No squirm. Squirming means Grotto miss. Cut wrong bits. I complied, perching on the edge of the table while the pain boy rummaged through a collection of containers, eventually producing a viscous green substance that bubbled ominously. Good medicine, he declared, dipping a filthy cloth into the mixture. Kill bad stuff, hurt lots, but umie tough, yes? Before I could respond, he pressed the cloth against my wound. The pain was immediate and intense, a burning sensation that went beyond mere physical discomfort. It felt as if acid was eating into my flesh, spreading outward from the cut. I clenched my jaw to prevent crying out, determined to maintain some shred of dignity. Grotto watched my reaction with obvious disappointment. No scream? Boring. He continued his ministrations, eventually producing what looked like a needle fashioned from bone and some kind of sinew for thread. His suturing technique was crude but effective, closing the wound in a series of rough stitches that would leave a significant scar. Throughout the procedure, I took the opportunity to study the room more carefully, noting potential weapons, exits, the patterns of guard movement. The information might prove useful, though escape seemed a remote possibility at best. More practically, I observed the pain boy's methods, filing away knowledge that might help me treat future injuries when proper medical attention was unavailable. All fix, Grotto declared finally, applying a paste of unknown composition over the stitched wound. No die from little cut now, save dying for arena, yes? More fun that way. When am I expected to fight? I asked, testing how much information I might glean. The pain boy cackled. When boss say fight, you fight. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next day. Whenever good crowd gather, big commissar man first fight always big event. So I had time, at least a little. Time to recover, to plan, to adapt to my new reality. Not that planning seemed likely to improve my circumstances significantly. What does one plan for when the future holds only violence for the entertainment of aliens? As I was escorted back to my cage, I passed other prisoners in various states of injury and despair. Some bore the marks of recent combat, others the wasting effects of prolonged captivity. A few met my eyes with something approaching recognition, perhaps respect for the commissar's uniform I no longer wore. Most simply stared blankly, already lost to whatever inner world they had created to escape this nightmare. One in particular caught my attention, a woman in the tattered remains of a Cadian officer's uniform. Her right arm ended in a crude mechanical prosthetic of obvious orcish design, likely the work of Grotto himself. Despite her condition, she stood straight, eyes alert and evaluating as I passed. A survivor, that one. Someone who had adapted to the horrific reality of our captivity without surrendering completely to it. Upon return to my cage, I found Varun anxiously awaiting news. The arena, he said, voice barely above a whisper. They rarely send new prisoners there directly. You must have impressed them somehow. Or merely confused them, I replied, settling carefully to avoid straining my freshly stitched wound. I refused to play by their rules. Orcs respect strength, even when it manifests as defiance. Perhaps, Varun agreed, though uncertainty tinged his voice. But the arena is no feeding pit. The orcs bring their favorite prisoners there, the ones who provide the best entertainment. They invest in those fighters, giving them better food, medical care, even weapons training. Not out of kindness, understand, but to prolong the spectacle. And what becomes of these favorites eventually? A shadow crossed his face. The same as all of us, Commissar. Death, sometimes quick, sometimes drawn out for maximum effect. The only difference is how long the journey takes, and how much of yourself you lose along the way. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. How much of yourself you lose. Already I could feel it happening, the small compromises, the mental adjustments necessary for survival. The commissar I had been would never have accepted treatment from a Xenos Medicae. would never have considered cooperation with the enemy, even in the limited form of participating in their combat rituals. Yet here I was, planning how best to navigate this new reality, how to survive just one more day in this metal hell. "Get some rest," Thorn advised from his neighboring cage. "Your wound may be treated, but your body needs recovery, and your mind more so. The arena will demand everything you have, both physically and mentally." I nodded, stretching out on the metal grating that served as floor and bed alike. Sleep did not come easily, interrupted by pain and the constant noise of the prison, the moans of the injured, the occasional bellowed laughter of orc guards. But eventually, exhaustion claimed me, dragging me down into darkness. I dreamed of the Imperial Schola where I had trained to become a commissar. The rigid discipline, the endless drills, the lectures on human weakness and how to combat it. In the dream, I stood before a class of cadets, delivering a lecture on maintaining morale in the face of Xenos horrors. But as I spoke, my uniform began to deteriorate, falling away in tatters. The cadets transformed before my eyes, their young, earnest faces becoming the brutish visages of orcs, leering and jeering as I stood exposed and vulnerable before them. I awoke with a gasp, sweat cooling on my skin despite the oppressive heat of the prison. Around me, the other prisoners slept or sat in silent contemplation, each trapped in their own private hell. I touched the wound at my side, feeling the rough texture of the stitches through the fabric of my shirt. Physical pain, at least, was something familiar, something I could understand and endure. The next day, if such temporal distinctions had meaning in this timeless place, began with the usual routine. Guards making their rounds, prisoners being selected for the feeding pit, the sounds of combat and suffering echoing through the chamber. I was left in my cage, my status as an arena fighter apparently granting some temporary reprieve from the daily struggle for sustenance. An orc I had not seen before approached my cage around what I estimated to be midday. Larger than the regular guards, with crude armor decorated with human teeth and finger bones, he carried himself with the swagger of authority. "Commissar man," he growled, voice like gravel. "Boss want talk, you behave, maybe keep all fingers today." My cage was unlocked, and I was once again escorted through the labyrinthine corridors of the prison. This time, however, we ascended, rather than moving laterally, climbing, through increasingly well-constructed sections of the complex. The walls transitioned from scrap metal to more permanent construction, suggesting we were moving from the improvised prison cells to the original structure, whatever it had been before the orcs claimed it. We arrived at what had clearly once been an Imperial command center. Faded aquilus still adorned some walls, though most had been defaced or covered with crude orcish symbols. The tactical display table in the center of the room now served as a throne of sorts, piled with trophies of war, human and otherwise, and upon this macabre throne sat the largest orc I had ever encountered, Warboss. The word surfaced in my mind automatically, a classification drilled into me during tactical training. This was no mere leader of a raiding party. This was a warlord, a commander of armies, a being of terrible purpose and power. His skin was darker than that of his subordinates, nearly black in places, crisscrossed with scars that spoke of countless battles survived. One eye had been replaced with a bionic implant, glowing red in its metal socket. His massive frame was augmented with crude but effective-looking mechanical enhancements, and the power claw that served as his right arm hummed with barely contained energy. "So," he rumbled, his voice surprisingly articulate for an orc. "This is the commissar who refuses to fight proper. The Umier who thinks he too good for Grisgutz's entertainment." I stood as straight as my injuries would allow, meeting his bionic gaze without flinching. "I am Commissar Jorven Kryl, servant of the God Emperor of mankind. I do not perform for Xenos amusement." A deep, rumbling laugh emanated from the warboss. "All Umis perform, Commissar man. Some just take longer to learn their part." He leaned forward, the throne creaking under his massive weight. "You fought my boys in the pit. Fought good, but didn't kill when kill was easy. Why?" The question caught me off guard. I had expected. Threats, perhaps torture, not philosophical inquiry from an orc warlord. "I will not kill my own kind for your entertainment," I replied after a moment. "That is not war. It is not even sport. It is merely cruelty." "Cruelty?" Grisgutz seemed genuinely puzzled by the concept. "Is fighting, is proving who's strongest, is orky way. It is not my way." The war boss studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he barked a command to one of his subordinates, who scurried from the room, returning moments later dragging a human prisoner. I recognized the man instantly. Sergeant Halleck, the guardsman I had witnessed killing a comrade in the feeding pit. He looked even worse now, emaciated, eyes darting nervously around the room, lingering on the war boss with naked terror. "This Umi kill other Umis for food," Grisgutz said, gesturing dismissively at Halleck. "Kill without honor, kill weak way." He turned his baleful gaze back to me. "You no kill at all. Which better, Commissar man? One who kills without honor, or one who lets others die because he too proud to get hands dirty?" The question struck deeper than I cared to admit. How many times had I executed guardsmen for cowardice or dereliction of duty? How many lives had I taken in the name of imperial discipline? Was that so different from what Halleck had done, killing to survive in an impossible situation? "There is no honor in this place," I said finally. "No glory, no purpose. Only survival and entertainment. I choose to survive without becoming a performer in your theater of cruelty." Grisgutz leaned back, a sound like grinding metal emerging from what I assumed was laughter. Big words from Yumi in cage. But Grisgutz curious now. "Want see how long Commissar man keep pride. Tomorrow you fight in arena, not other Yumi. Something special. Something worthy of Commissar." He gestured, and I was seized by the guards, dragged unceremoniously back toward the door. As we left, I heard the war boss issue another command. A scream cut through the air, abruptly silenced. I did not look back. I knew what had become of Sergeant Halleck. The return journey to my cage was conducted in silence, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them pleasant. What special opponent awaited me in the arena? What fresh hell had the war boss devised to break my resolve? When I was roughly shoved back into my cage, Thorn and Verun looked up expectantly, clearly burning with questions. I recounted my audience with the war boss as concisely as possible, including the fate of Sergeant Halleck. "The arena tomorrow," Verun whispered, fear evident in his voice. "Against something special. Emperor protect you, Commissar." "The Emperor seems distinctly absent from this place," I replied, more bitterness in my tone than I had intended. "I will have to rely on more immediate resources." Thorn nodded approvingly. "Pragmatism, the first step toward survival. What resources do you have, Commissar? Inventory them. Physical, mental, spiritual. Leave nothing unconsidered." I took his advice, systematically cataloging my assets. Physically, I was in better condition than most prisoners, thanks to the rigorous training regimen commissars maintained even during extended deployments. The wound in my side was painful but no longer life-threatening. Mentally, I had the tactical training of the Schola Progenium, the ability to analyze combat situations quickly and effectively. Spiritually, I paused at this juncture, uncertain how to proceed. The faith that had once burned so brightly within me seemed diminished now, a guttering candle rather than a roaring flame. The words of the Imperial Creed no longer sprang readily to mind. In their place, doubt, questioning, a growing suspicion that the universe was far more cold and indifferent than the ecclesiarchy would have us believe. "You hesitate at the spiritual," Thorn observed, his perception uncomfortably acute. "The crisis of faith, I have seen it, in many who pass through this place. Even the most devout eventually question why their God has abandoned them to such suffering." "The Emperor tests us all," Verun interjected, though his tone lacked conviction. "Our faith is proven through tribulation." "A comforting thought," Thorn replied, not unkindly. "But consider this. If the Emperor tests us through suffering, What then is the difference between his methods and those of the dark gods? Do they not also offer pain as the path to enlightenment? Such talk bordered on heresy, the kind I would have executed a guardsman for uttering in my previous life. Now, it merely prompted further questioning in my own mind. What purpose did this suffering serve? What lesson could be learned from being forced to fight for the amusement of Xenos? I was spared from pursuing this uncomfortable line of thought by the arrival of food, if the slop pushed through the cage bars could be dignified with such a term. Still, it was sustenance, and I consumed it mechanically, knowing I would need all the strength I could muster for whatever awaited me in the arena. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. I spent the hours in meditation, a practice taught at the Schola to clear the mind before battle. I visualized various combat scenarios, potential opponents, strategies for victory or at least survival. But without knowing what I would face, the exercise felt hollow, a futile attempt to prepare for the unknowable. Morning announced itself with increased activity among the guards, an air of anticipation evident in their movements. Today was a spectacle day. Today, a commissar would fight in the arena. The thought was clearly exciting to the greenskins, whose love of violence was matched only by their love of novelty. I represented both. 4 guards came for me, more than previously, suggesting either respect for my potential as a threat or the importance of the event. Perhaps both. They bound my hands before opening the cage, taking no chances with their prized combatant. "Good fortune, Commissar," Varun called as I was led away. The traditional Imperial Guard farewell before battle, though we both knew fortune had little to do with what awaited me. The arena, when I finally saw it, was both more and less impressive than I had imagined. A converted hangar bay, its ceiling open to the polluted sky above, its floor covered in sand stained dark with blood of various colors. Surrounding the central fighting area were tiered seating arrangements, already filling with orcs of all sizes, from runts barely larger than human children to massive knobs rivaling the war boss himself in bulk. I was taken to a holding area beneath the stands, where various creatures were confined in cages similar to those in the main prison, though these were ground level rather than suspended. Most of the occupants were human, presumably other fighters who had graduated from the feeding pits to this more formal entertainment. But there were other species as well. A snarling Kroot warrior, something that might once have been an Eldar but was now so mutilated as to be barely recognizable, even what appeared to be a juvenile tyrannid, though how the orcs had managed to capture and contain such a creature was beyond my comprehension. My bonds were removed, and I was ushered into a preparation area where, to my surprise, my commissar's uniform jacket and cap awaited. Both had been crudely repaired, the jacket missing its right sleeve entirely, the cap stained with what was likely the previous owner's blood. Still, they were symbols of my office, my identity, and I donned them without hesitation. "Look proper now," one of the guards commented, sounding almost approving. "Good fight better when fighters look part." A weapon rack stood against one wall, containing an assortment of Imperial Guard issue equipment, likely scavenged from the battlefield where I had been captured. I was directed to select one item. My hand hovered over a las gun briefly before moving on. In close quarters combat, a bayonet would serve better than a ranged weapon with limited ammunition. I selected a combat knife, testing its edge and weight. Serviceable, if not ideal. A klaxon sounded, and the crowd noise above increased dramatically. The guard gestured toward a ramp leading up to the arena floor. "Go," he said simply. "Fight good, die good. Either way, make good show." I ascended the ramp with measured steps, forcing myself to move deliberately rather than rushing or hesitating. The noise hit me like a physical force as I emerged into the open arena, a wall of sound composed of shouts, jeers, and the clashing of weapons against armor or shields. The crowd, seeing my commissar's uniform, reached new heights of excitement. In the center of the arena stood the war boss, Grisgutz, his massive form even more imposing in the open space. He raised his power claw for silence, and remarkably, the crowd obeyed. the noise dropping to a low murmur of anticipation. "Today," Grisgutz bellowed, his voice carrying effortlessly to the furthest reaches of the stands, "we got special fight. Imperial Commissar Man, big boss who shoots coward Umis, against something from Umie nightmares, something that eat worlds and never stop." A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Surely he could not mean. A gate at the far end of the arena ground open, and my worst fears were confirmed. The creature that emerged was unmistakable, despite its relatively small size. A tyrannid warrior, its chitinous armor gleaming dully in the sunlight, its multiple limbs ending in wicked talons, its eyeless head swiveling as it scented the air, and sensed me. The crowd erupted in excited shouts as the creature oriented toward me, its posture shifting from cautious to predatory in an instant. I raised my knife, knowing full well how hopelessly outmatched I was. A commissar against a tyrannid warrior was not a duel, it was an execution. Grisgutz retreated to a downs, a protected observation platform, his booming laugh audible even over the crowd noise. "Fight, start now," he declared, "no end until one dead." The tyrannid charged, covering the distance between us with frightening speed. I dodged its initial rush, rolling across the sand and coming up in a defensive crouch. The creature recovered quickly, more quickly than something its size should have been able to, pivoting to face me again. I circled warily, knife held low and ready, searching for weaknesses. The tyrannid's carapace appeared damaged in several places, likely from previous arena fights, or perhaps its original capture. One limb moved slightly out of sync with the others, suggesting an injury not fully healed. Vulnerabilities, but how to exploit them with only a combat knife. The creature charged again, but this time I stood my ground, waiting until the last possible moment before sidestepping. As it passed, I slashed at the damaged limb, feeling the knife connect with something softer than carapace. Ichor sprayed across the sand, and the tyrannid screeched, a sound that vibrated painfully in my skull. The crowd roared its approval, and I was reminded that this was not merely combat for survival. It was performance. The longer I lasted, the more entertainment I provided, the more value I had to my captors. It was a sickening calculus, but one I could potentially use to my advantage. The tyrannid circled more cautiously now, wary of my blade. I used the moment's reprieve to scan the arena more thoroughly, looking for anything that might serve as an additional weapon or tactical advantage. The sand was littered with debris from previous contests, bones both human and Xenos, fragments of armor, the occasional glint of metal. The creature lunged again, this time feinting to draw my dodge before changing direction. I anticipated the maneuver, having fought similar opponents during my service, though never so directly or with such poor equipment. I parried a talon with my knife, the impact numbing my arm to the shoulder, and delivered a kick to the tyrannid's injured limb. It staggered momentarily, and I pressed the advantage, slashing at its face, aiming for the sensory organs I knew existed beneath the armored carapace. The knife scored a hit, drawing more ichor, but the tyrannid retaliated with a sweep of its tail that caught me across the legs, sending me sprawling into the sand. I rolled immediately, barely avoiding the killing strike that followed. The talon embedded itself in the sand, where I had been a heartbeat earlier. I slashed at the limb, opening a wound that pulsed with alien fluids. The tyrannid recoiled, giving me space to regain my feet. The crowd was fully engaged now, cheering and jeering with each exchange. I caught glimpses of orcs exchanging what I assumed were wagers, teeth changing hands as the fight progressed. My survival had become a gambling proposition. The thought would have been amusing in other circumstances. The combat continued in this fashion for what felt like hours but was likely only minutes. A dance of attack and counter, wound and riposte, neither of us able to land a decisive blow. The tyrannid was stronger, faster, better armed by nature, but I had intelligence, training, and most critically, experience fighting its kind. I knew the patterns, the tendencies, the weaknesses. Still, attrition would favor the Xenos. Its regenerative capabilities, even diminished by captivity, outstripped mine. Each exchange left me more battered, more fatigued, while the tyrannid seemed tireless, driven by instincts older than humanity itself. A misstep, a moment of fatigue-induced slowness, and I failed to completely avoid a slashing talon. Pain erupted along my left arm as the chitin edge opened a deep gash from shoulder to elbow. The crowd's excitement peaked at the sight of human blood, fresh roars of approval echoing through the arena. I retreated, trying to put space between myself and the increasingly aggressive tyrannid. It sensed weakness now, injury, the prospect of a kill. My options were dwindling rapidly. The knife, effective as it had been for defense, lacked the stopping power needed to bring down a creature of this size. My back hit something solid, a support pillar at the arena's edge. No further retreat possible. The tyrannid advanced deliberately now, savoring the coming kill in whatever alien way its species comprehended such concepts. I tightened my grip on the knife, determined to sell my life dearly if this was indeed the end. And then I saw it, half buried in the sand near my foot. The unmistakable shape of a frag grenade, likely dropped by a previous combatant, or perhaps deliberately placed as an element of chance in the arena battles. Either way, it represented my only real hope of survival. I lunged for it just as the tyrannid charged. My hand closed around the metal sphere as talons slashed across my back, tearing through the uniform jacket and into flesh beneath. I rolled with the impact, coming up in a crouch, grenade now clutched in my bloody hand. The tyrannid rounded for another charge. I waited, timing essential now. Too soon, and it would have time to evade. Too late, and I would not survive to deploy the weapon. It leapt, a perfect predatory arc that would end with me impaled on its talons. I primed the grenade, ducked beneath its trajectory, and as it passed overhead, shoved the explosive into a gap in its carapace where previous damage had left the inner tissues exposed. The detonation was almost immediate. The tyrannid's body absorbed much of the blast, but the shock wave still threw me across the sand. My ears rang, vision blurred from the concussive force. Through the haze, I saw the creature's ruined form twitching in its death throes, limbs spasming, ichor pooling beneath its shattered carapace. The crowd's reaction was delayed, as if they could not quite process what they had witnessed. Then, as realization dawned that the human had somehow emerged victorious, a sound unlike any I had heard before erupted from the assembled orcs. Not merely approval or excitement, but something approaching religious awe. A human, armed with only a knife, had defeated a tyrannid warrior in single combat. It was the kind of improbable victory the orcish mind was perfectly evolved to appreciate. I struggled to my feet, swaying with exhaustion and blood loss. My uniform hung in tatters, more red now than black with the blood that soaked it. But I stood, knife still clutched in one hand, facing the warboss's observation platform with all the dignity I could muster. Grisgutz himself seemed momentarily speechless, his bionic eye whirring as it focused and refocused on me. Then he threw back his massive head and laughed, a sound like artillery fire that echoed through the arena. "Commissar man full of surprises," he bellowed when his mirth subsided. "Grisgutz like surprises. Make life interesting. You live today, fight again soon. Maybe something even better next time." I was retrieved from the arena floor by the same guards who had escorted me there, though their demeanor had shifted subtly. There was something approaching respect in their rough handling, as if I had become more than just another human prisoner in their eyes. Rather than returning me directly to my cage, I was taken to the Medicae area, where Grotto waited with his dubious healing arts. The pain boy seemed almost gleeful at the extent of my injuries, taking particular interest in the talon slash across my back. "Good wounds," he declared, applying his burning unguent to the gashes. "Clean cuts. Heal good with right medicine. Make good scars. Scars important for arena fighters. Show survival." I endured his ministrations stoically, too exhausted to do otherwise. When he had finished stitching and binding my wounds, I was given water and what passed for food in this place, though of noticeably better quality than the slop served to regular prisoners. protein-rich meat of uncertain origin, some kind of fungal bread that was surprisingly palatable. The message was clear. I had become an investment, a source of entertainment worth maintaining. When I was finally returned to my cage in the main prison chamber, word of my victory had already spread. Prisoners watched me pass, with expressions ranging from awe to calculation. I had survived the arena, defeated a tyrannid in single combat. In the bizarre social hierarchy of the prison, this elevated me to a status just below the orcs themselves. Verun greeted me with naked relief, while Thorn merely nodded, as if my survival confirmed some private theory of his. "The arena champion returns," he said, no mockery in his tone despite the grandiose words. "You have achieved what few humans ever have, Commissar, the respect of the orcs." Respect? I collapsed onto the floor of my cage, every muscle screaming in protest. Is that what this is? Being forced to fight Xenos abominations for their amusement? In orcish culture, yes, Thorn replied. Combat is their religion, their art, their science. By surviving, by fighting well, you have earned a place in their mythology. "I want no place in their mythology," I muttered, though even as I said the words, I recognized their futility. What I wanted had ceased to matter the moment I was captured. There was only what was and what might be. "Nevertheless, you have it," Thorn continued. "And with it comes certain privileges. Better food, medical care, perhaps even certain freedoms within the compound. These can be leveraged, Commissar, for survival or perhaps something more." The implication was clear. Escape. The word hung unspoken between us, too dangerous to voice aloud, yet suddenly more tangible than it had been before. My new status might indeed create opportunities, openings in the otherwise impenetrable security of the prison. But at what cost? I had already compromised so much, participating in their blood, sports, accepting their crude medical care, consuming their food. Each concession chipped away at my identity as an Imperial Commissar. How much could be sacrificed before nothing remained of Jorven Kryl but an empty shell, a performer in the Orcs' theater of cruelty? The days that followed established a new routine. I was fed regularly, given water that was almost clean, allowed periodic visits to a washing area where the worst filth could be removed. My wounds were checked by Grotto, healing well despite the primitive nature of his treatments. And each day, I was taken to a training area where I was permitted to exercise, to maintain the physical condition that made me valuable as an arena fighter. It was during these training sessions that I encountered her again, the woman with the mechanical arm I had glimpsed during my first escort through the prison. Up close, I could see that she was indeed Cadian, the distinctive purple eyes marking her heritage unmistakably. The mechanical arm was cruder than I had initially thought, a painful-looking assemblage of scavenged parts that whirred and clicked as she moved. "Commissar Krail," she greeted me, her voice strong despite her obvious physical hardships. "Your reputation precedes you, the Tyrannid Slayer, they call you now." "And you are?" I asked, continuing my exercise routine, wary of showing too much interest. "Major Ven, 89th Cadian," she replied, "or I was, before this." She gestured around us with her mechanical arm. "Now I am simply another performer in the arena." "How long?" 6 months, give or take. Time blurs after a while. She watched my movements critically. "Your form is good, but you favor your right side too obviously. In the arena, such tells can be fatal." I adjusted my stance, recognizing the validity of her observation. "You've survived 6 months in the arena. That suggests considerable skill." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Skill, luck, and a willingness to become what is necessary to survive. The orcs appreciate innovation in combat. Predictability bores them, and bored orcs find new entertainment. We trained together after that, sharing techniques, strategies, observations about various opponents we had faced or might face in the future. Major Ven had encountered nearly every type of creature the orcs threw into the arena, from other human prisoners to xenos of various species. even some of the orcs' own feral squigs, when other entertainment was lacking. During our sessions, always watched by guards but rarely interrupted, we spoke of other things as well. Of the prison's layout, of the patterns of guard rotation, of the hierarchy among our captors, information gathering, disguised as casual conversation. Preparing, always preparing, though neither of us explicitly mentioned escape. I learned that the prison was part of a larger complex, a former Imperial outpost that had been overrun during the initial orc invasion of the planet. The arena had once been a landing bay for shuttles, the feeding pit, a storage area for supplies. The orcs had simply adapted the existing structures to suit their own barbaric purposes. Major Ven had mapped much of the facility during her time as an arena fighter, the elevated status granting her more mobility than regular prisoners. She knew the schedules of guard changes, the locations of weapon stores, even the habits of the war boss himself. Grisgutz is more intelligent than most of his kind, she told me during one session, her voice low to avoid being overheard. He understands the value of keeping certain prisoners alive, not just for entertainment but for information. He interrogates Imperial officers personally, extracting what tactical knowledge he can before sending them to the arena. To what end? I asked. Orcs are not known for strategic warfare. This group is different, more organized, more purposeful. Grisgutz has ambitions beyond random violence. He studies his enemies, learns from them. It makes him more dangerous than the average war boss. The implications were disturbing. An orc leader capable of strategic thought, of adapting Imperial tactics to his own forces, could pose a threat far beyond the usual greenskin warbands. Such information would be invaluable to Imperial command, if it could be delivered. Another motivation for escape. Then, not merely personal survival, but duty. The thought brought a strange comfort, a connection to the commissar I had been before captivity. Duty had always been my North Star, my guiding principle. Perhaps it could be again. Weeks passed in this fashion, training, healing, gathering information. I fought twice more in the arena, once against a captured Kroot mercenary, once against a pair of human prisoners who had earned the orcs' displeasure. I survived both encounters, though not without cost. New scars joined the old, both physical and mental. The guilt of killing fellow humans, even in self-defense, added to the weight I carried. Through it all, the plan took shape. Not just an escape, but something more ambitious. A strike against our captors, a message to the war boss that humans were not merely entertainment to be used and discarded. Major Ven and I were the principal architects, but others were cautiously brought into our confidence. Thorn, with his medical knowledge, a former tech priest who had knowledge of the facility's systems from before its capture, even one of the human trustees who had earned limited freedom by serving the orcs as a translator. The opportunity came during what the orcs called a Wa festival, a celebration of battle that involved prodigious consumption of fungus beer and ritualized combat among the greenskins themselves. Security would be reduced as many guards participated in the festivities, and those remaining would likely be less attentive than usual. The plan was simple in concept, though complex in execution. Major Ven and I, as arena fighters, had access to the training area and its limited supply of weapons. During our scheduled session, we would overpower the reduced guard detail, acquire their weapons, and proceed to free as many prisoners as possible. The former tech priest believed he could access the original Imperial security systems, using them to seal certain areas of the complex and potentially contact any Imperial forces in range. Success was far from assured. Even with reduced numbers, the orcs were formidable opponents, and an alarm would bring reinforcements quickly. But the alternative was continued captivity, continued degradation, until we either died in the arena or became so transformed by our experience that death would be a mercy. The appointed day arrived with the strange inevitability of long-planned operations. I awoke feeling oddly calm, the familiar pre-battle clarity settling over my mind. My wounds had healed as well as could be expected given the circumstances, and my strength had largely returned. I was as ready as I would ever be. When the guards came for my training session, I noticed immediately that there were indeed fewer than normal, and those present showed signs of recent celebration, movements slightly sluggish, attention not fully focused. A good omen, if one believed in such things. Major Ven was already in the training area when I arrived, going through a series of exercises with her mechanical arm, which had been recently adjusted by Grotto to allow greater dexterity. She acknowledged me with a nod, her eyes conveying what words could not. Today was the day. We began our usual routine, warming up separately before engaging in practice combat. The guards watched with the same bored attention they always did, having seen this performance many times before. Slowly, we worked our way toward the equipment rack where practice weapons were stored. Not ideal for actual combat, being blunted or weakened to prevent serious injury during training, but better than bare hands. The signal was a specific phrase, chosen for its innocuous nature. "The Emperor's mercy comes in many forms," I said as we circled each other, practice blades at the ready. Major Ven nodded almost imperceptibly, and we moved. I threw my blade at the nearest guard, the blunted metal still capable of causing distraction if not serious harm. As he raised his arm to deflect it, I was already upon him, driving a knee into his abdomen, where the crude armor left a gap. He doubled over, and I struck the back of his neck with clasped hands, a killing blow made possible by the guard's poor positioning. Across the room, Major Ven had engaged the second guard with similar efficiency, her mechanical arm proving surprisingly effective as a bludgeoning weapon. The metal fist connected with the orc's jaw, shattering tusks and sending the creature staggering backward. She followed up with a flurry of strikes to vulnerable points, her knowledge of orcish physiology evident in each precisely placed blow. Within moments, both guards lay dead or incapacitated. We stripped them of their weapons, crude but functional shooters and sluggers, along with the key mechanisms that would open the prisoner cages. Time was now our enemy. The bodies would be discovered at the next guard check, if not before. "The security control room first," Major Ven said, checking the ammunition in her newly acquired shooter. "Then the cell blocks." I nodded agreement, and we moved out, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The corridors were less populated than usual, many orcs having gathered in the arena for the WARG celebrations. Those we did encounter were dispatched quickly and quietly, their bodies hidden where possible to delay discovery. The security control room was located near the warboss's command center, a fact that added significant risk to our plan. But it was essential, both for freeing the other prisoners and for any hope of contacting Imperial forces. We approached cautiously, listening for any sound that might indicate occupancy. 2 guards stood outside the door, more alert than those we had encountered earlier. These were not the dregs of the warband, but trusted lieutenants, chosen for reliability. They would not be so easily surprised. Major Ven signaled her intent with hand gestures, indicating she would draw their attention while I circled behind. I nodded, understanding, and moved to position, using the irregular construction of the corridor for concealment. She stepped into view, still carrying herself like an arena fighter on her way to training. The guards tensed, shooter barrels rising to cover her. "Umi not supposed to be here," one growled. "Arena that way," he gestured with his weapon. "I was summoned," Major Ven replied, her voice steady. "Warboss wants information about next fight. Special entertainment for end of festival." The guards exchanged glances, uncertain. It was plausible enough. Grisgutz did occasionally summon favored fighters for such purposes. The moment of hesitation was all I needed. I emerged from concealment behind them, firing both sluggers simultaneously. Orc physiology is remarkably resilient, but even the toughest greenskin cannot withstand multiple point-blank shots to the base of the skull. They fell without raising the alarm, and we dragged their bodies out of immediate view. The security room itself was unmanned, another stroke of fortune in a plan that needed all it could get. The former tech priest had described its layout accurately, the mixture of Imperial technology and crude orcish modifications exactly as he had predicted. Major Ven stood guard at the door while I accessed the systems. Imperial security codes were designed to be memorable even under extreme stress. I entered the emergency override sequence the tech priest had provided, and was rewarded with the distinctive hum of systems responding. The display flickered, Imperial script replacing the crude orcish symbols that had overlaid it. I initiated the cell block release sequence for the prisoner areas, while simultaneously activating the emergency beacon. If any Imperial forces were within range, they would receive the standard distress call. Whether they would respond was another matter entirely. This planet had been written off after the initial Orc invasion, the survivors presumed dead or as good as. Alarms began to sound throughout the facility, not the result of our detection, but rather the automatic response to unauthorized system access. The element of surprise was now gone, but in its place was chaos, and chaos could serve our purpose just as well. "Time to move," Major Ven said from her position at the door. "The cells will be opening now. We need to arm as many prisoners as possible before the Orcs organize a response." We headed for the nearest armory, guided by the facility map now displayed on my commandeered data slate. The alarm had created exactly the confusion we had hoped for, Orcs running in multiple directions, some to battle stations, others to the prisoner blocks, still others to the arena, where many of their leaders would be gathered. None paid particular attention to two armed figures moving purposefully through the corridors, just two more bodies in the growing chaos. The armory was guarded, as expected, but the defenders were looking outward for an approaching threat, not expecting an attack from behind. We eliminated them efficiently and accessed the weapons store. Inside was a treasure trove of Imperial equipment, captured during the initial invasion and subsequent raids. Lasguns, autoguns, even a few heavier weapons like flamers and melter guns. By now, prisoners were emerging from the opened cells, moving cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as they realized the opportunity being presented. The first group to reach us included Verun and Thorn, both looking shocked but determined. "Commissar," Verun greeted me, his voice thick with emotion. "We thought, when you did not return, that you had died in the arena." "Nearly," I replied, handing him a lasgun from the armory stores. But it seems the Emperor had other plans. Thorn accepted a weapon as well, examining it with the careful precision of a medicae inspecting a surgical tool. "I have not fired one of these in many years," he said quietly, "but I believe the necessary muscle memory remains." More prisoners arrived, and we distributed weapons and brief instructions. Not all would fight, I knew that. Some were too broken by captivity, too injured, or simply lacked the will. But many would, if only for the chance to die with a weapon in hand rather than for the entertainment of their captors. As the armory emptied, Major Ven and I prepared to move to the next stage of the plan. The primary goal was escape, to get as many prisoners as possible to the surface and potentially to an Imperial vessel if our distress call was answered. But I had a secondary objective, one I had not shared with the others: Grisgutz. The war boss who had turned humans into entertainment, who had stripped away dignity and identity with the casual cruelty unique to his kind. Intelligence value aside, I wanted him dead, needed him dead in a way that transcended tactical considerations. It was personal now, a vendetta that would not be satisfied until I saw the light fade from his bionic eye. "You are thinking of going after him," Major Ven said, reading my expression with disconcerting accuracy. "It is a suicide mission, you know that." "I know," I acknowledged, "but some things must be done, regardless of the cost. Get the others out. If I succeed, I will follow. If not, ensure that what we learned here reaches Imperial command." The nature of this warband, its organization, its leaders' tactics, it could save lives in future conflicts. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded once, sharply. "For the Emperor," she said. "For humanity," I replied. The distinction felt important somehow, a subtle shift in perspective that reflected my changed understanding of the universe. Then, I was moving, heading deeper into the facility rather than toward the surface, toward the arena where the war boss would be overseeing the WAAGH celebrations. The fighting grew heavier as I approached the arena, the orcs becoming more organized as their leaders took control of the situation. I expended ammunition carefully, making each shot count, knowing I would need every advantage when I finally confronted Grisgutz. The arena itself was in chaos when I arrived, orcs fighting each other as much as they were combating the escaped prisoners who had made their way here. In the center of it all stood Grisgutz, bellowing orders, his power claw crackling with energy as he cut down any who showed weakness or confusion. I took up position on one of the observation platforms, the same one from which the war boss had watched my own arena battles, fitting that our positions should be reversed for this final confrontation. I aimed carefully, waiting for the perfect shot, the moment when he would be most vulnerable. A movement to my left alerted me to danger, and I spun to find one of Grisgutz's lieutenants, the painboy Grotto, advancing with a surgical saw raised to strike. I fired instinctively, the shot catching him in the chest. He staggered but did not fall, orcish resilience keeping him upright and dangerous. "Commissar man," he growled, a grotesque parody of a smile revealing metallic teeth. "Grotto fix you up, make you strong. This how you thank. Consider it the final payment for your medical services," I replied, firing again. This time he went down, green blood pooling beneath him. But the exchange had cost me precious seconds and revealed my position. Grisgutz was looking directly at me now, his bionic eye whirring as it focused on my location. A grin split his brutish features, and he gestured with his power claw in what might have been a salute or a challenge. "Commissar man," he roared, his voice carrying over the battle noise. "Come down and fight proper. Show Grisgutz if Umi still remember how to be soldier, not just arena pet." The taunt struck deeper than he could know, touching on doubts that had plagued me throughout my captivity. Had I indeed become what I despised, a performer in their theater of cruelty? Was I still a commissar in anything but name? There was only one way to answer those questions. I descended to the arena floor, keeping my weapon trained on the war boss, though I knew from experience that even multiple direct hits would not stop an orc of his size unless they struck a vital point. We circled each other in the center of the arena, just as I had circled so many opponents in this same blood-soaked sand. But this time, I was not fighting for the entertainment of aliens. I was fighting for vengeance, for justice, for some fragment of redemption. "Why you run, Commissar man?" Grisgutz asked, his tone conversational despite the circumstances. "You good fighter, respected, could have become legend in arena." "I am not an animal to be caged," I replied, sighting down the barrel of my weapon. "Not entertainment for Xenos amusement, I am an Imperial commissar." He laughed, the sound like stones in a grinder. "You more than commissar now, you survivor, fighter. You learn what really important, not fancy titles or big speeches, just living through one more fight." There was a twisted wisdom in his words, a brutal truth I had come to understand during my captivity. In the end, stripped of ideology and identity, survival remains the most basic imperative. But it was not the only imperative, not for a human. We were defined by more than just the animal drive to continue existing. "There are things worth dying for," I said. "Principles that matter more than survival. That is what separates us from you." "Dying easy," Grisgutz replied with a dismissive gesture. "Living with principles hard. You learn that in arena. How much of fancy commissar talk you throw away to live one more day?" The question struck home, echoing thoughts that had tormented me during the darkest moments of captivity. How much had I compromised? How much of Jorven Kryl, Imperial Commissar, remained after all I had endured and done? But in that moment of confrontation, facing the architect of so much suffering, I found clarity. Yes, I had changed. Yes, I had compromised. But the core remained, the essential humanity that no amount of orcish cruelty could eradicate. "Enough talk," I said, raising my weapon. "Let us finish this as warriors." Grisgutz roared his approval and charged, power claw leading, faster than anything his size had any right to move. I fired repeatedly, aiming for vulnerable points, the shots impacting with visible effect but not slowing his advance. I dove aside at the last moment, feeling the rush of air as the power claw passed inches from my head. Rolling to my feet, I continued firing, focusing now on his bionic eye, hoping to blind him at least partially. A lucky shot connected, and the eye exploded in a shower of sparks. Grisgutz bellowed in pain and rage, swinging wildly now, his movements less coordinated but no less dangerous. I circled, looking for an opening, knowing that my ammunition was limited and running out rapidly. The opening came when he overextended on a power claw swing, momentum carrying him forward and exposing his back momentarily. I closed the distance instantly, pressing the barrel of my weapon against the base of his skull, and fired the remaining ammunition in a sustained burst. Even an orc warboss cannot withstand such concentrated damage to a vital area. Grisgutz staggered, then slowly collapsed to his knees, then face down in the sand. I stood over him, weapon still trained on his motionless form, waiting for any sign of life. There was none. Around me, the battle was turning. The escaped prisoners, armed and organized, were pushing back the Faros, confused orcs. Without their warboss to direct them, the greenskins were reverting to their more chaotic nature, fighting individually rather than as a coordinated force. I became aware of a presence beside me. Major Ven, bloodied but very much alive, surveyed the fallen warboss with satisfaction. "The evacuation is proceeding," she reported. The distress signal was received by an Imperial Navy patrol ship in the neighboring system. Extraction vessels are inbound. "Casualties?" I asked, professional concern reasserting itself, significant but less than anticipated. The confusion worked in our favor. Many prisoners reached the surface armories and secured additional weapons. I nodded, suddenly aware of the profound exhaustion settling over me. The adrenaline of combat was fading, leaving behind the accumulated weight of captivity, of suffering, of survival. "It is over, then," I said quietly. Major Ven glanced at me sharply. "This engagement, yes, but the war continues. The Imperium will have need of experienced officers who understand how the enemy thinks, how they operate." The implication was clear. Return to duty, resume my role as commissar. Rejoin the endless conflict that defined human existence in this dark millennium. The path I had always expected to walk until death claimed me in service to the Emperor. Yet I hesitated. The man who had been captured, who had endured the arena and the feeding pits, was not the same man who would return. My understanding of humanity, of the enemy, of the nature of the struggle itself, had been fundamentally altered. Could I simply resume my former role as if nothing had changed? "You are thinking you cannot go back to what you were," Major Ven said, again displaying that unsettling perceptiveness. "And you are right. You cannot. But perhaps you can become something more useful, more effective because of what you have experienced." I considered her words as we made our way toward the extraction point. Around us, liberated prisoners moved with a mixture of disbelief and determination, many still clutching the weapons that had secured their freedom. Imperial forces had established a perimeter on the surface, Navy armsmen securing the area for the evacuation shuttles. As we boarded, I caught sight of Verun helping Thorn onto the craft, the old Medicae moving stiffly but with dignity intact. They had survived, as had I, changed, scarred, but alive. There was purpose in that survival, meaning to be found in continuing forward rather than dwelling on what had been lost. The sensation as the shuttle broke atmosphere was one I had experienced many times before, yet never with such profound relief. Below us, the orcish prison dwindled to insignificance, just another blighted structure on a contested world. But its impact would remain, carried within each survivor, a transformation both terrible and profound. I found myself thinking of the feeding pits, of the moment when I had refused to kill for the entertainment of our captors. It had seemed like defiance at the time, a small victory against overwhelming circumstances. Now I recognized it as something more, a reclamation of humanity in the face of degradation. The beginning of a journey back from the abyss. The Imperial officer who debriefed me aboard the Navy vessel was brisk and professional, recording my account with the detached interest of one who had heard many such stories of survival against impossible odds. To him, I was simply another resource, a source of intelligence about enemy capabilities and behaviors. "Your insights on the war boss's tactical adaptations are particularly valuable," he commented, reviewing his notes. "Such organizational capability is unusual among orcs. We will adjust our strategic approach accordingly." "There is more," I said. "The human element. What happens to people when they are reduced to entertainment, to sport, how some break and others adapt, how thin the veneer of civilization truly, island." He looked at me blankly, clearly not understanding the significance. "I am sure the Munitorum psychiatrists will want to evaluate you and the other survivors for combat readiness. Standard procedure after captivity situations. Combat readiness, as if the only value in our experience was whether we could be returned to the front lines." Perhaps he was right. From the Imperium's perspective, the war machine required fuel, and that fuel was human lives, human suffering. Yet I could not help but feel there was a lesson in what we had endured, something fundamental about the nature of humanity when stripped of its protective structures, something both horrifying and hopeful. We had the capacity to become animals, yes, to fight over scraps and betray comrades for momentary advantage. But we also had the capacity to resist, to maintain some core of dignity, even in the most degrading circumstances. The orcs had sought to reduce us to entertainment, to performers in their theater of cruelty. Some had indeed been reduced, becoming what was necessary to survive. But others had found different paths, small resistances, moments of humanity preserved against all odds. I was assigned temporary quarters aboard the Navy vessel, a luxury beyond imagining after months in a metal cage. Clean bedding, private washing facilities, food that was not only nutritious but actually palatable, simple comforts that I had once taken for granted, now appreciated with almost religious gratitude. Sleep remained elusive, however. When I closed my eyes, I saw the feeding pits, the arena, the faces of those who had not survived. I heard the roar of the orc crowd, the screams of the dying, the desperate sounds of humans fighting over rotting meat. These memories would fade in time, perhaps, but never disappear entirely. They were part of me now, woven into the fabric of my being. On the third day of our journey back to Imperial space, I sought out Major Ven. She was in the ship's training area, moving through a series of exercises designed to rebuild strength and coordination, her mechanical arm now attended to by proper tech priests rather than the crude ministrations of Grotto. "Commissar," she greeted me, "the medical officers tell me you have declined their offer of augmetic replacements for your damaged tissues." I touched the scar that ran along my jaw, a souvenir from the Tyrannid warrior. "Some marks should remain visible, I think. Reminders." She nodded, understanding. "And your plans once we return? Will you resume your commissarial duties?" The question had occupied much of my thinking since the rescue. The commissariat would expect it, would see no reason why I should not continue as before. I had survived captivity, had even organized a successful breakout. My file would note the experience as a commendation rather than a concern. "I am not certain the commissariat is where I can best serve now," I said slowly, the thought taking shape as I spoke it. "My understanding of the enemy, of human response to extreme conditions, might be better utilized in special operations or perhaps intelligence analysis." A hint of a smile touched her lips. A commissar questioning his ordained role, another change wrought by captivity. "Not questioning the importance of the role," I clarified. "Merely my own suitability for it, given what I now understand. The Imperium needs its symbols of authority, its enforcers of discipline, but it also needs those who understand the reality beneath the symbols, the true nature of both the enemy and ourselves." "And you believe you now possess such understanding?" I considered her question carefully. "Not complete understanding. but a perspective few others have. The orcs saw us as entertainment, as performers in their theater of cruelty, but in forcing us into those roles, they revealed truths about humanity that might otherwise remain hidden. About resilience, about adaptation, about what remains when everything else is stripped away. "And what does remain, Commissar Kreil?" she asked, her exercise forgotten as she studied me intently. "Choice," I said after a moment. "Even in the most constrained circumstances, even when reduced to the most basic struggle for survival, we retain the ability to choose our response, to fight with dignity or surrender to animalistic instinct, to help others or focus solely on personal survival, to maintain our humanity or become merely another performer in the theater of cruelty." She nodded slowly, a lesson worth learning perhaps. "Even at such cost." "Worth sharing as well," I added. "Which is why I have begun writing a report, not just on the tactical aspects of the Orc warband, but on the psychological impact of captivity, on the methods of resistance, on the patterns of survival, information that might help others who find themselves in similar circumstances." "The Commissariat may not look favorably on such focus," she warned. "They prefer their doctrine uncomplicated by psychological nuance." "Then perhaps my future lies elsewhere," I said. "The Ordo Xenos might value such insights. Or perhaps a training role, preparing those who might face capture to resist manipulation and degradation." We continued discussing possibilities as the ship made its way through the warp toward Imperial space. The future remained uncertain, the scars of captivity still fresh, the memories still vivid. But uncertainty was preferable to the false certainties I had clung to before, the rigid doctrines that had proven so inadequate in the face of actual suffering. "I am Jorven Kreil, once a commissar of the Imperial Guard. I have been entertainment for aliens. I have fought in their arena and survived their prison. I have killed and refused to kill, compromised and held firm, lost faith and found new purpose. I am changed, marked by the experience in ways both visible and invisible, but I am not broken. Not a performer following a script written by others, whether human or Xenos. The theater of cruelty claimed many victims, but in the end, it failed to claim my humanity. That remains, scarred but intact, a foundation on which to build whatever comes next. The lesson of the prison was not that humans can be reduced to animals, though that is certainly possible. The lesson was that even in the most dehumanizing conditions, the choice to remain human persists. It is a harder path, a more painful one in many ways, but it is the path I choose to walk, now and in whatever future awaits me in the darkness of the far millennium. For in the end, what separates us from the Xenos, from the heretic, from the mutant, is not our physical form or our devotion to the Emperor, necessary as that may be. It is our capacity to choose compassion over cruelty, dignity over degradation, humanity over barbarity, even when all structures of civilization have been stripped away. That is the final lesson of the Orc prison. That is what I carry forward into the endless war that awaits. Not just survival at any cost, but survival with purpose, with meaning, with humanity intact. The Emperor protects, or so we are taught. But when his protection fails, when we find ourselves alone in the darkness, it is our choices that define us. It is our choices that save us, if we are to be saved at all.